Hello, everyone. This is your host, Dania Arayssi, for the Central Asia podcast at the New Lines Institute. Thank you for listening for us. Today, we are joined by Ambassador Daniel Rosenblum, former U.S. Ambassador to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, who served nearly 3 decades at the State Departments across 5 presidential administrations. We will be discussing today the future of U.S. engagement in Central Asia under a new administrations. Ambassador Rosenblum, thank you so much for being with us today and for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. My first question for you is really, can you spend a long time in the State Department, nearly 3 decades from your career at the Central Asia and Eurasia? My first question is, what really drew you to that region, and how has U.S. approach evolved over that time, given that you spent a long time there?
Yeah, so I was drawn to the region from actually a young age. My father was actually a human rights activist in the 1960s and 70s, trying to help Jews in the Soviet Union to practice their religion, and then when they couldn't, to emigrate. And he was very involved in those activities while I was growing up. So I was surrounded by people coming from the Soviet Union. My dad would take on speaking tours and so on. They would stay at our house. So I got very interested in, kind of what's going on over there. What's this all about? I learned a few Russian words at the time, and so on. So I later, pursued that in college, and then eventually in grad school, I was a Soviet studies major. So I kind of knew this was the region I wanted to focus on. And I joined the State Department in 1997, not as a Foreign Service officer, which is the usual way people come in, but initially as a contractor, and then later a civil servant. So because of that, I was able to focus on that region for my entire career.
Right.
You asked about sort of the evolution of U.S. policy during that time. And I think actually what's most interesting to me as I reflect on the past is how much continuity there was in policy through different administrations. I came in the Clinton administration, and then it was George Bush, and then it was Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. Through those changes in party and overall, clearly changes in overall foreign policy, the policy to the former Soviet Union, Eurasia, and Central Asia remained pretty similar. And it was focused on supporting the sovereignty and independence of those countries, particularly, of course, the ones surrounding Russia. Russia didn't have to have anyone fighting for their sovereignty and independence. And also focused on, I guess, maintaining stability in the region and economic growth that would reinforce stability. Right. So those basic goals remained very similar throughout the time I was there. Right. And obviously there were changes in emphasis and nuance along the way, but more continuity than change.
Right. Thank you so much. Before we start the podcast, you mentioned to me that you have personal experience with the Jackson-Vanik sanctions.
Yeah.
The Jackson-Vanik sanctions are something we are working on it here at the Central Asia Center. We're pushing for the S7 and really removing those sanctions to help push these economies to work together and are regionally connected. Can you talk to us, if you want to share a little bit about the Jackson-Vanik, what it means for you, and why do you think it's important to maybe remove these sanctions and help these economies move forward?
Yeah. So I actually have an unusually personal connection to it, which surprises people because it goes back a long way.
Yes.
I mentioned that my father was active in this Soviet Jewry movement all the way back to the early 1960s. And it turns out that my dad was one of the people in the United States pushing to adopt legislation that would connect trade relations and treatment of trade with communist countries that were in the communist bloc, that would link that with their policy on emigration, allowing people to emigrate. And this was, seen as a way to pressure them to allow Jews, especially, but not only Jews, to emigrate freely, which is a basic human right that every country should respect. And in 1974, my dad and a group of other people succeeded in influencing Congress to pass it.
Wonderful.
So in a sense, I'm responsible, or my family's responsible. Yes. And by the way, a lot of people don't even know anymore who the Jackson and the Vanik were. So Jackson was a senator from the state of Washington. Henry Scoop Jackson was what he was called. Really hardline, hawk on anti-communists in those years.
Yeah.
So he supported it. But the Vanik was a congressman from Cleveland, which is my hometown, and it was our congressman.
Right.
So obviously my dad had a certain, channel to reach him. So that's who the Vanik was.
Okay.
Anyway, so fast forward 30 years.
Yes.
Actually more than 30 years, almost 50 years now, right?
Yes.
50 years later. And when I was ambassador to Uzbekistan and then later in Kazakhstan, it was clear to me that Jackson-Vanik was obsolete, that the time had come to repeal it.
Right.
I think I realized that earlier than that in earlier years. And of course, it has been repealed for many other countries in the region. Even Russia had Jackson-Vanik repealed back in, I think, 2011, 2012.
Right.
So it's time to do it for the Central Asian countries. But I will just add that it's really more, just so everyone realizes what Jackson-Vanik does, there's a waiver provision which allows you to waive the sanction of Jackson-Vanik and give the country the full access to the U.S. market, the same treatment of goods that every other country gets.
Right.
It's called Permanent Normal Trade Relations, PNTR.
Yes.
And that waiver has been given for Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan every year for as long as anyone can remember.
Right.
Because clearly they don't restrict emigration, so there's no reason to put it on them.
Right.
So as a practical matter, it's really not getting in the way of our trade.
Perfect.
It's not reducing trade because it's waived every year. However, the countries point out, rightly, I think, that as symbolically and politically, it's damaging for them to have this hanging over them. It's not really fair for them to have this, kind of black mark, you might say, of being under this provision. So it's time.
Right.
It's time to repeal it. It's time to get rid of it, especially for Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan.
Two of the very large economies right now working with the United States.
Yeah.
I want to reflect with you on the on your work under the different administrations. So you resigned from your post on January 2025. And without getting into this, the political, but I want to just understand from you, can you share with us what it was like to hand over the keys to in such a very important moment, because we had a change in the administrations for a new ambassador, and how this and informing them about these regions that you've worked on it for a very long time.
Yeah. So, briefly, it was, I also don't, without getting political on this, I decided to resign in late 2024.
Right.
It was a point in my career when I thought, I'm ready to open a new chapter in my life. 28 years at the State Department.
Exactly.
I thought, I'll resign now and leave this for a new person in the new administration. Now, I had a deputy in Astana, a woman named Deborah Robinson, who I had recruited myself to come in and be my deputy. She arrived the previous summer, and I knew that she was very capable. And so I thought, I can leave things in her hands, give her the keys, as you said, and things will continue to run quite well. It's always better to have a Senate confirmed ambassador in a country, but I knew that there would be a period where Debbie would be running things, and I was confident in her ability, and she did do a great job. And it did take almost a year for a new ambassador to get there. And the woman who is now our ambassador in Kazakhstan, Julie Stuft, someone who I actually didn't know before, even though we both worked at State for years, our paths just didn't cross. But I got to know her before she went out. Julie sought my advice, and I helped her for her confirmation hearing and for preparing to go out to Astana. She asked great questions, and I know she's already doing a fantastic job, and she'll continue to do, because she really wants to learn, and she's extremely experienced diplomat. So in Kazakhstan, we had a good handover, although there was that year when we had a charge, Debbie. But in general, I felt good about the transition.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to discuss with you about the C5+1 summit. The November 2025 C5+1 summit that was at the White House was kind of the first of its kind. We see all the 5 Central Asian presidents meeting with the President Trump in the White House. There was deals made around $34 billion that were announced. announced. Some analysts here in DC were talking that the current administration is simply implementing ideas you and your previous colleagues under the Biden administrations have been pushing for a long time. Do you see a continuity in terms of like how each administration is working with Central Asia from the current Biden to the current Trump administration, from Biden administration to the current Trump, or do you see there's a change with how the administration is working with Central Asia?
Yeah. So this is something I've thought about a lot, of course, because I follow events in U.S. Central Asian relations closely, right. And reflecting on my career, I said earlier that there's been more continuity in policy than change. I do think there's been some change in terms of emphasis with the Trump administration. Okay. But what hasn't changed is this idea of engaging with Central Asia on a regional basis with the 5 countries together. Right. At the same time, we've always had really strong ties bilaterally and have engaged bilaterally with each of the countries. And I think it's important to maintain both of those. The regional approach is helpful both, frankly, sometimes it's just a matter of the time for senior leaders. Right. It's economical for them to get all 5 at once. Right. But more importantly, this idea of the region being viewed as a cohesive unit that cooperates and integrates is to the benefit of the region, I think. And certainly I think the Central Asian countries recognize this, which is why they bought into it. So this idea of having a C5 continues. The change I see is, again, it's more one of emphasis than a fundamental change. Right. The emphasis in this administration is very much on making deals. Right. And of course, President Trump talks about that a lot. He said, like, we're going to make a deal with so-and-so. What some people refer to as transactionalism is extremely pronounced. And the last thing I'll say about this is transactionalism can be a good thing, especially to the benefit of U.S. business and U.S. companies. Yes. And in that respect, it's not new. We always tried in my years, and it wasn't even just in the Biden administration, going back to the first Trump administration, the Obama, and further back, we always tried to promote the interests of U.S. companies and to help them make investments and sell their goods in the region. And we had a lot of successes. Exactly. We had some failures too, but we had a lot of successes. And so that's not new. But what I see happening now is an almost exclusive focus on the transactionalism, it seems. This idea that the main thing we're going to do in engaging with other countries is get them to invest in the U.S. or buy our goods, and maybe we'll also buy some of their things or get some of their things, critical minerals being, maybe first and foremost. Right. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Right. But if it's the only thing, then I don't think it's the best way to maintain long-term sustainable relations. Right. I think we need to focus more broadly on security relations, security cooperation. Right. We need to focus also on governance. I don't think we can ignore that. Human rights and democracy is important. And I think having a multifaceted relationship is the best guarantee for a stable long-term relationship.
This is a very good way to end the answer, because I have 2 questions about democracy and about the influence of China and how the United States is kind of, countering this. When it comes to, I want to talk about the Chinese influence here. So for a very long time, and we've seen it right now, China is expanding its influence in Central Asia in many ways, and primarily through the Belt and Road initiatives and plans that they have. You've spoken many times about the U.S. being a short-term pessimist, and you said the long-term optimist. I think this was the sentence that you used about Central Asia. Does the U.S. have the tools, I would say, right now to counter the Chinese influence in Central Asia? And when I'm talking about the Chinese influence, it's not only economically. We're seeing in education, in technology, in investments, in highways and roads. So do we have the tools as a government to kind of step in and kind of replace or try to stop this?
Yeah. Well, in short, I think the answer is no. Okay. I'll be very honest on this. I don't think. When I say no, I don't mean we can't offer anything that the Central Asians want, or that we can't what's the word? Up our game and do more. I think we can, but I don't think we can really compete dollar for dollar or dollar for yuan or whatever with the Chinese, or frankly, even in terms of presence and just engagement. It's really hard for us to compete. I'd like to think that the U.S. could have as many high-level meetings, build as many big infrastructure projects, or provide as much military hardware, because that's another aspect that's starting to change with the Chinese getting in there. But from what I saw throughout my career and knowing China's advantages, I don't think it's possible. I mean, China has, first of all, they have proximity, obviously. They share a 1,200-mile border with Kazakhstan. They share borders with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan as well. They have a strong incentive to build out those economic ties, not only because they want to get their goods to Europe and they're looking for different routes to that, but also they believe it's important for the economic growth of Western China, of Xinjiang, to have that kind of connection. So they have the motivation, they have the proximity, and they also are really good at linking their policy to their resources, and often better than we are. I'll be honest. Again, I just think they beat us at that game. And so, and from the perspective of the Central Asian countries, we always said to them, we're not asking you to choose. It's not us or them. But we recognize that they're going to choose China in many cases. And I think our goal should be not to match dollar for dollar, but to always be a viable alternative to the Chinese, or of course the Russians. We haven't talked about the Russians yet, but to be an alternative, whether it's on security, on investment, on economic engagement, and as long as we're doing that, we're giving them space, the Central Asian countries, space to be truly sovereign, right? To make their own decisions and not to be entirely dependent on their big neighbors.
100%. And I think this is happening right now with United States pushing for the C5+1 and all these economies working together. Totally. I do want to ask questions about democracy and governance, because you've worked in both democratic and non-democratic economies and Republicans. And so my question is, do you think is something lost when how we are approaching the relationship with Central Asia? Because as you mentioned, we're focusing a lot on the transactions and the economy, but there is less emphasis on the governance and the human rights and the liberal values that we all champions here. So is something lost when the values dimensions kind of disappears from these relationships, or how we're approaching it?
Yeah. I mean, this is something, again, that I spent a lot of time on during my tenure.
Yes.
And that I've had time to reflect on since I retired a year ago. And I do believe that let's call it the governance agenda, should be part of our engagement with Central Asia. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that it's who we are as Americans and American foreign policy. I know that maybe not everyone agrees with that, and certainly the current administration generally does not seem to agree with that. But I believe it's true, and it's enshrined in law for us. I mean, the annual human rights report that's required by Congress and has been since the late 1970s tells us that we have to report, and it should be objectively and in a balanced way. Unfortunately, the last report, I think, was not quite up to that standard, about conditions for human rights. And even though it's often inconvenient in our day-to-day relations with other countries, I think it's just who we are. It's a reflection of the American people, the American values that we project to the world. But beyond that, I actually think that there are practical reasons why it's important. One of them is that we've seen over time, over history, that countries that don't have accountability to their population, that become distant from them, authoritarian, corrupt, that those countries tend to be fragile. And over time, maybe they seem stable for some decades, and then everything blows up. And our goal in the world, I believe, should be to seek stability and peace.
Stability,
Stability and peace. And I don't think poorly governed countries are the best way to get that. In fact, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite.
Yeah. So I think as a practical matter in terms of our global goals, an emphasis on those issues is important. And then finally, I think the key point to remember when it comes to carrying out foreign policy and developing relations with countries is that, sometimes these goals compete with each other or conflict.
Right.
So an emphasis on democracy can sometimes get in the way of developing a strong security partnership with countries. I've seen this, this played out in Uzbekistan during the years that I was Deputy Assistant Secretary. This is before I was ambassador there, where we had to decide how far do we want to go in giving military equipment or doing training with this government, which was known for having serious human rights abuses. And we proceeded carefully, I think, and with proper conditions. But the point is that you have to be doing those things together. I used to say we need to know how to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right.
We can have a security relationship and partnership, especially when there are key interests. Maybe it's fighting terrorism. Maybe it's, in this case, supporting our efforts in Afghanistan at the time. And at the same time, have a very strong dialogue and exert pressure on them to improve their practice on basic human rights.
100%.
So anyway, it's more complicated to do it this way.
Right.
It's easier if you just push all that to the side. Right. It uncomplicates your relationship in a sense. But again, for long-term stability, to be true to American values and what the American people, I think, want as reflected in the legislation we have, we need to have that be part of our agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So we want to wrap up the podcast with the ambassador. Thank you so much for your time. I want to give you last few minutes if you want to say any comments that you have about the regions, the politics of the regions, the critical minerals.
Well, maybe I will say a word about the critical minerals since you mentioned it a couple times.
Yes.
This is something I spent a lot of time on when I was in Kazakhstan because the Kazakhs wanted more U.S. investment in that sector very badly.
Right.
We had one U.S. company, in fact, which is still expanding its activity, just signed a big new deal to mine tungsten called Cove Capital.
Right.
And soon after I got there, Cove applied for some licenses to explore different deposits of critical minerals and was rejected.
Right.
They tried, through the regular process that was set up by the Ministry of Industry and Infrastructure. And we ended up having to go into the government and say, this seems completely at odds with what you've been telling us, which is that you want more U.S. business here. And here's a U.S. company that is trying to get in on the front end, for the exploration, and they can't get the licenses. Cove, I think, believed that there maybe was some shady dealing going on in the background, maybe involving Chinese companies or something. I have no evidence that was true, but they believed that.
Right.
And so we advocated strongly for them, and it was reversed because the government recognized there was a contradiction there.
Right.
So we wanted to see more U.S. companies get in to the sector. And it's important, of course, from a U.S. national interest that we have secure supply lines that can bring those important materials to our industry.
Right.
It's, the technologies of the future need these minerals. And so that's key. But one thing that we worked on at that time, so this is during the Biden administration, that I believe has been maintained, but maybe doesn't have quite the same energy in the Trump administration behind it, was called the Mineral Security Partnership.
Okay.
And I thought this was a really key initiative because what it was is a group of consuming countries, the countries that need the minerals, it mostly, highly developed European, U.S., East Asian countries that don't have enough on their own territory, need to import them. And they formed a partnership with some of the producing countries, one of which was Kazakhstan. I think Uzbekistan joined it as well. And the idea was to make deals and also just figure out the right matches between the need for the minerals and the supply.
Right.
And the important concept underlying this is that we're all in this together. It's a success for one is a success for all.
Exactly.
So even if it's not a U.S. company getting the contract for a lithium mine in Kazakhstan. But if it's an Australian company or it's a Canadian company or a British company, that's good for this idea of secure supply lines to, like-minded partners.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that approach is better, because if we just rely, what we found, maybe this will change going forward, but what we found was there's just not enough capacity within the U.S. mining industry to do all of it, or to come in. And the U.S. companies had other things that they were working on, including in the United States, developing new deposits. And so they weren't flocking to Kazakhstan. But if collectively we can figure out a way to build this up, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan could become major suppliers to the West of these important
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for all your time. And thank you so much for going overtime with us. We really appreciate your generosity on the time. Thank you so much for watching and listening to us. And take care.